What's up guys, and welcome to another video. And today it's the turn of the Mercedes W10, and I'm pleased to say, although they released the car as a digital render at first this morning, we have now got some images of the car on an actual racetrack, which is lovely to see because we haven't seen that with any of the other cars at this point, certainly not on launch day. It's a really nice looking car is the first thing I've got to say. For two reasons I'm impressed. There's lots of detail. Even on the renders there was quite a lot of detail, much more so than most of the other teams had chosen to release to the public at that point. The other reason is that I like the way that Mercedes have kind of stuck to their principles on lots of areas of the car. They haven't followed the crowd, they haven't followed what has become the sort of trend in many areas, as I'll go through in a moment. They've stuck to their own views, their own principles, their own development path, which has been successful for them, let's not forget, over the last few years. It's easy to say, well, maybe that's obvious. Maybe, of course, they're going to stick with what they've got. They've been winning, which is obviously true to some extent. But when the rest of the field start to look in other areas, start to follow slightly different solutions, it's very easy to be drawn into that and to sort of lose focus on your own design protocols, your own design philosophy. And it looks to me like Mercedes haven't done that, which I think is a really nice strength on their behalf. For what it's worth, I also like the livery. I think it looks great on track. A tweak on last year, but I think some nice tweaks. But let's look at the technical details of it, and I've got a series of photos including the renders which were pretty accurate, having now seen the car on track. Now look, I like the way that they've approached this. As I say, lots of interesting ideas. Let's start with the front wing. The front wing, very different to the approach that we saw Renault take in yesterday's release, where Renault had their upper flaps, the top four planes of the front wing, kind of converging down to a low point on the rear wing end plate. It looks like Mercedes have maximised the use of all of the available space. You know, the regulations give them a kind of box within which they can put bodywork or put pieces of wing elements. And whilst Renault certainly didn't take up all of that, Mercedes actually look like they have taken up most of that space, which you could read into. First of all, you could say that, well, they're using all of that space, they're creating as much downforce as they can, but you can only do that if the rest of the car can balance that out. So if you've got loads of downforce on the front, but you can't generate as much downforce on the rear, it's going to be very, very front heavy in terms of aero balance, which won't give you, you know, a kind car on its tyres. It won't give you a kind car for a driver in terms of its behaviour. So perhaps you could suggest that if they'd be able to create a huge amount of downforce on the front, they've also managed to match that or balance that out at the rear, which is potentially a solid positive sign for them. They have got, like we've seen before, they've got little support brackets connecting the planes of the wing here, angled in such a way that they will help the airflow. So these inner brackets here angled this way, which will help direct the vortices coming off these tips, heading off this way through the front suspension to the barge boards, etc. You can't quite see them, but other support brackets on this side look to be slightly more angled outwards towards the end plate or the end section of the wing. I guess slightly interesting that they have got a slightly different profile again to what Renault had. Upturned end of the main plane, and a slight little arc at the end of what we call the sort of Y250 section. You might hear lots of people talking about the Y250 section or the Y250 Vortex. The reason we talk about that is because in the regulations the car is measured on different axes. The Y-axis is this axis across here, and the regulations stipulate an area of the front wing 250 millimeters from the centre line of the car in each direction, which has to be a neutral section. The teams are not allowed to put bodywork in there, and so that is called the Y250 section. And the Y250 Vortex that we hear so much about is the vortex or the vortices that come off these inner tips. So the first part between the transition between the Y250 section, neutral section, and then the team's allowable space section, each of these little tips of these flaps generates a vortex as the airflow spills over the top of one and each of the other, all generating this vortex, working in exactly the same direction, spinning up, very, very powerful because they all combine to work together. Very powerful, combined with this little arc section here, will start to drive a really powerful spinning vortex through this section, which the barge boards then pick up and drive around using that barge board or the deflector section, drive around and behind the front tyre, pulling out with it that horrible messy wake, messy airflow that comes off the front tyres that the aerodynamicists desperately want to get rid of. The front tyres, in fact tyres in general, but the front tyres are an aerodynamicist's worst nightmare, because not only are they rotating, of course, and they're squashing up and down as the car goes over bumps and through aerodynamic forces, they're moving up and down in comparison to the other aerodynamic surfaces of the car. But also, of course, the front tyres, they turn in terms of their angle as the driver puts a steering input in. And that, in terms of modelling that in aero, is an absolute nightmare. You know, an aerodynamicist wants a fixed, controlled surface that he can then, you know, design the bodywork to flow the airflow around it. When this thing's turning and moving all over the place, that becomes a very difficult area, which means the airflow coming off the back of this is horrible, messy, it's turbulent, and so we don't want it interfering with any of this section of the car where we really need free stream air, or as much free stream air as we can get. So this big powerful Vortex, and last year of course the outwash of the front wing end plate and the front wing, used to be designed together with the blown axle that we had before to drive as much airflow out and away from the car, dragging with it that horrible, messy, turbulent wake of the front tyre. Well, much of that has gone. We've got no blown axles this year, no or minimal outwash on the end plates and the front wing design, so teams are having to utilise this Y250 Vortex in a much more powerful fashion, using the barge board area, which has come a little bit further towards the front of the car, to collect that and divert it off to the areas that they need it to work most. That's the thinking behind the changes. That's why Mercedes have gone for this kind of arrangement. I think most teams are converging on similar designs, or they will do, I'm sure, but because it's a new area, it will be an area that gets developed rapidly over the early part of the season. I like the fact that Mercedes have kept with their narrow nose cone, which they had last year. Most other teams have gone for a much wider section down here with kind of arced supports around here to collect and drive airflow through the middle, underneath the front wing, or underneath the front nose rather, towards the middle section, as I said before. What Mercedes have done, and you'll see this better in a picture in a moment, is use the cape. You may remember they had the cape last year, this great big sort of swooped angled section here that other teams have used as well, to collect airflow, pushing it downwards towards this really sensitive section under here, the underfloor, and then this complex barge board arrangement around here. So it's all about pushing airflow to the areas that you want it to be worked further downstream along the car. We can also see from this picture the mirrors, following the kind of concept that some of the other teams have gone for, not the concept that Renault took yesterday, but pushing them really far outboard, using the stay as an aerodynamic device. So that is formed in aero section, utilised to push airflow onto the bodywork, keep it attached to the bodywork so that the airflow follows the contours of the bodywork all the way down towards the back of the car. And they've also got another stay further outboard just here, which will be doing exactly the same thing, helping to divert airflow towards the inlet, the cooling inlet behind the tyre here, and some more of it down around the sides to pass through these other aerodynamic device sections back here. What else can we see from this picture? We can see that further back on the car we've got a big T-wing, full width allowed by the look of it, slight step in the middle, and a downturned, almost like an end plate on the end. Again, this will be designed to create a vortex, which will help energise the airflow underneath the front wing and around the rear wing, and around the rear wing end plates. And also a little monkey seat. They've gone for two stay support here for the rear wing mounts. Last year they had one central one that then arced around the exhaust tailpipe in the middle. They've gone for a double support this year with a little monkey seat winglet in between. Everything designed to try and aid the performance of this rear wing, which this year is much higher up than it was last year. So anything we can do to aid some of that performance, some of that upwash, will really benefit the upwash of the front wing, rear wing. Must get my front and rear correct. The rear wing. There's a little flick up here which you'll see better in a moment in another picture, which is also doing the same thing, helping to drive upwash from the diffuser and to aid the performance of the rear wing. It's a good photo this because we can see quite a lot. The floor really detailed, and the renders actually showed this as well. Some of the other teams have just given a pretty blank vision of what their floor is at the moment to potentially hide details or hold details back. Mercedes has gone for a number, I mean a high number, I haven't counted them, but there's a lot of sort of angled slots towards the rear of the floor. That's to deal with what we call tyre squirt. So as the airflow is passing over this rotating tyre, when it meets the point between the tyre and the racetrack, it has nowhere to go, and so it squirts out in both directions. Some of it squirts out that way, which is fine, but some of it squirts out inwards. And that squirt, that tyre squirt, can be really detrimental towards the performance of the floor. And so these slots here are about directing airflow down, creating a channeled airflow that spills through these, rotates through and runs along the inside of the rear tyre, protecting, almost like a virtual skirt or a virtual wall, protecting this tyre squirt, stopping it going inboard and interacting with the diffuser flow, which would just minimise the diffuser's effect and its efficiency. We've got some longitudinal slots further forward, which we talked about on the Toro Rosso, again designed to spin up a Vortex, which will run along the side of the car, doing a similar job to this, but now protecting the floor here, almost like the ground effect skirts that we saw back in the 70s. We're not allowed to have those anymore, so now we do it virtually with spinning airflow, spinning vortices coming off these to try and seal up as much as we can this floor section. We've got a turned up section moving even further forward on the floor, which will be helped to collect the airflow that's coming through this section here and drive it round towards, some of it will be driven around towards the back channel here, following the path of that tightly sculpted bodywork. And then other parts, see, it's got a slight flick out here. Some of this will be designed to try and create some outwash, again to try and take airflow around, you know, collect some of this front tyre wake, drive it away from the car and away from the central sections of the rear car and the underside of the floor, like I talked about. Looking at this picture then, you can see that Mercedes haven't followed the trend of the really high Sidepod inlet. And they are one of the last teams to not follow that trend. They haven't followed it last year. Lots of other people, it was a trend started by Ferrari a couple of years ago. Lots of other teams have started to follow that by raising up the inlet as high as they can to collect airflow above the top of the front suspension. Mercedes have gone for a much deeper, sort of bigger really opening on the side pod here, but what that allows them to do is to keep the whole thing shrunk in slightly narrower. You can have less of an undercut underneath, but the whole thing is shrunk in considerably from where it was last year. So they have got this huge opening, which they're using little veins on the side of the car here. You can just see one there, big downwash vein, to separate airflow passing along here. Some of it will pass down through this section and follow the contours of the bodywork towards the top of the diffuser section. And then others that pass above it will go straight in here to aid cooling of the car. They say that on the power unit side, the cooling is much more efficient this year, which means they have less cooling requirements, which of course then means you get an aerodynamic advantage from that by being able to shrink in the bodywork. They've got on the front suspension, same thing they had last year, where they've raised the top wishbone up on a stalk. So this top wishbone here, looking very horizontal, on other cars would normally come down at an angle and slot in and tuck onto the top of the upright inside the wheel. What Mercedes have done is created a bracket or a mounting point that sticks up out of the top of the upright and allows the front wishbone to attach in a horizontal fashion. And that creates a larger gap between top and bottom wishbone to drive as much airflow, cleaner airflow through, to then be worked by this section and to get into that cooling duct on the side of the side pod there. So a different philosophy. Lots of other teams have opted to keep a much more conventional suspension arm down inside the wheel rim connected to the upright there. Lots of really nice detailed work going on here, much more so than we've seen on lots of the other teams. Lots of split vertical straights, lots of horizontal winglets, like this one, like I say, creating a massive downwash. Others here creating a downwash. There's others that you can't see behind the front wing here, behind the front wheel here, all designed to help aid that airflow, pick up as much of it as they can and channel it through this complicated section, which is all about collecting, as I said, that front wing vortex, trying to aid as much as it can the collection of that front wheel messy wake and drive some of it as far outwards as possible. Other sections here will be to drive airflow through the floor and follow that contour. If you remember a few years ago we were talking about the Coanda effect a lot, where exhausts were being blown into that Coke bottle area. We talked about the Coanda effect where airflow tends to follow the contours of bodywork. Well, that's exactly what we rely on here, this airflow following this swept contour of the bodywork into the Coke bottle area where it's so useful. What happens is, if that contour becomes too aggressive, if the angle becomes too sharp, the airflow, the Coanda effect, sort of falls over. The airflow detaches itself and then becomes horrible and messy, not what you want. So some of these devices around here are all about helping to guide it, helping to channel it, and keep that airflow attached to that bodywork, aiding that Coanda effect that we've seen in the past. The overhead airbox, very similar, I guess, in terms of design and shape to previous years on the Mercedes. Quite big, almost oval shape, split into three as it was previously as well. We've got a cooling duct, which you can just about see here, a cooling exit duct to allow some of the hot air out from the side pod, passing along the bodywork as well. You can clearly see here the double mount for the rear wing, which is new for this year, and the T-wing, and that little monkey seat in here. Similar to what I just talked about there, this big winglet or strake coming off the side here, this turning vane, mounted to the top of the bodywork here and then coming down towards the barge board, is also mounted or supported by these winglets, or these, it's a support, but it's obviously being used as an aerodynamic aid too. Again, doing exactly the same thing. You can even see the angle at which they're mounted there to help drive that airflow in towards this crucial area here. Zooming in at the rear of the car then, we can see some nice details around the rear wing end plate, similar to other cars where we're just looking to diffuse the airflow, to smooth the transition between the airflow that's attached to these bodywork sections and the airflow that detaches or that departs the car behind, trying to reduce drag in those areas. You can also see this nice little flick up detail on the back of the rear crash structure. That's where the little rear light sits. That is, again, just trying to aid the upwash effect, to support the upwash from the diffuser and to aid the upwash from the underside of the rear wings. As long as we can push that upwards, we get more performance out of both of those elements. Also looks like the rear wheels are following that same controversial concept that we saw introduced towards the end of last year. We can't now have blown axles, as I said. 150 millimeters in diameter from the centre section is a banned section. We can't blow any airflow through that, but we can blow airflow through the outer part of the wheel rims, and that, I'm sure, will be an area that lots of teams will look to exploit in trying to aid that outwash, to pull away that messy airflow from around the rear, the wheels and the sensitive areas of the car. It's a nice looking car. I like the way it looks. I like the way it's been presented. Will it be a fast car? It's got some nice technical details, an evolution from what Mercedes have pioneered over the last few years, but crucially an evolution from that concept that Mercedes has had and been so successful with over the last few years. Will it be dominant again in 2019? We'll have to wait and see.